Hello and welcome back to another episode of the Curiosity Monkey podcast. So in today's episode we're going to have a look at net zero and in particular have a look at whether net zero is really worth it. So if you read the news you'll see a lot of information online surrounding net zero and quite a lot of criticism. Different political parties have also been critical of net zero policy and have kind of maybe started to move away from it where they originally supported it. But in today's episode we're going to review all the data around net zero and come to some conclusion whether the pursuit of net zero is a worthwhile endeavour. To begin with, I think we can all agree, well, hopefully all agree, that climate change is a real and serious global issue. And the fact that the climate is changing is supported by an overwhelming body of peer-reviewed scientific evidence. And this evidence demonstrates that human-caused greenhouse gas emissions have led to the observed rise in global average surface temperatures over the last 100 years or so. And because that there is so much evidence, there's no longer any legitimate debate that A, the climate is changing, and B, that humans are the primary cause. Now, this isn't to say that there aren't things up for debate in climate science. There are still a lot of areas that are quite uncertain, and these for sure are up for debate. But these particular two things, there's just overwhelming evidence to support them. So denying these facts ignores the scientific consensus and the large, massive amounts of data that supports it. And in the UK, most people do believe that the climate change is real. Approximately 84% when surveyed of people believe that climate change is real. Although 17% do still believe that it's not caused by humans. But despite the scientific and public consensus that climate change is real, there is still a lot of anti-net zero rhetoric which is being growing stronger, it feels like, over the last year or so. And in this episode we will look at the reasons that net zero critics are citing, why net zero could be harmful, and we will evaluate these claims to see if there is any truth there. And while the facts of the climate and climate change lie in the science, whether or not we do anything to prevent further warming depends on our actions around emissions. This is strongly linked to policy that is put forward by politicians, and therefore climate change is a political topic. So while in this podcast, of Curiosity Monkey, I usually have stayed quite far away from politics because it's not so matter of fact, in this episode we will have to go into a bit of the politics, as climate action is strongly linked to politics. So, what about politics? Well, I guess the most obvious case worldwide, in the US, we have Donald Trump, and he is very anti-net zero policy. And he's publicly called climate change a con job and a hoax. And upon retaking the White House in January, as Trump has stripped mentions of climate change and global warming from government websites, he has rolled back many climate policies designed to reduce emissions, cut funding significantly to climate research organisations such as NOAA, which is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. He's pulled the US out of the Paris Agreement, which its aim is to limit temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. And more recently, he did not attend COP30, which is currently being held at the time of recording. This may not be much of a surprise, considering the oil industry invested millions and millions of dollars to help get Trump elected. So you can see why he may be so against net zero policies. If he's being paid millions and millions of dollars by the oil industry, then he have a lot of incentive not to pursue net zero policy and to increase the rollout of fossil fuel technology. And obviously the fossil fuel sector opposes net zero because it directly threatens its business model. You cannot keep emitting large amounts of carbon dioxide if you want to reach net zero, and the whole fossil fuel industry is surrounding around burning fossil fuels, which, well, produce carbon dioxide. So what about the UK? Well, probably most notably, Nigel Farage on the up recently in polls in his Reform Party, and he has been highly vocal on his criticism of net zero. His party, Reform UK, advocates for scrapping net zero policy and blocking green investment. He argues that the UK cannot afford it, and this claim resonates strongly with the public because of the UK's energy bills being some of the highest in the world. So it can be easy to believe that the rollout of renewable technologies and net zero technologies are responsible for the rising energy costs. And those rising costs have hit people quite hard. So trying to pay for heating, electricity, it's much harder than it was. But it's not just the Reform Party and Nigel Farage, it's also the Conservative Party more recently have kind of gone back on their net zero commitments that they originally had. So the leader of the Conservative Party, Kemi Badenoch, recently pledged to repeal the Climate Change Act of 2008. This act basically makes net zero by 2050 a legally binding target. But what do the public think? I think many people underestimate the importance of net zero because of competing global issues and economic concerns. But most individuals would support net zero if it could be achieved magically or very cheaply, but many people are commonly hear of the massive financial burden that it will bring to the UK if we do pursue net zero. But is this really such a burden? So in this episode, we'll demonstrate that achieving net zero is a fundamental global goal if we want to halt warming, and that's kind of by definition of what net zero is. And we'll also demonstrate that the long-term benefits of achieving net zero will far outweigh any short-term costs, and this applies to the costs of adding extra carbon dioxide, which leads to further warming, but also we'll look at the large co-benefits that we will observe by trying to get to net zero. The key argument here is that there are many politicians across the world, whether that being Trump in the US, Farage and Badenoch in the UK, that are misleading the public about net zero. This is either for financial gain or political gain so they can get votes and get elected. So let's look at a little bit of climate change stuff first before we get into net zero specifically. So no surprise here, the world is warming at an accelerated rate. Warming unequivocally caused by human greenhouse gas emissions that have increased atmospheric greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, mainly carbon dioxide, but also other ones such as methane. And current global temperature are approximately 1.3 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. And at current rates, they're rising at more than 0.2 Celsius per decade. And the Paris Agreement we discussed before, that target was the aim to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. But as we just said, we're already at 1.3. We're getting very close to that. And so it seems that it's going to be very unlikely that we'll limit our warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius, even with drastic action. And under high emissions scenarios, global temperatures could rise up to 5.5 degrees Celsius by 2100. And this highlights the extreme importance of reaching net zero so we can prevent getting to the stage, really. Now, while 1.2 degrees Celsius increase doesn't sound like a whole lot, the climate is quite sensitive to small changes in temperature, and so by increasing that temperature, it can have large knock-on effects on the weather and climate worldwide, and this is what we're seeing. And also it's important to mention here that the heating we've observed to present is approximately linear to the carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere, and the consequences of this heating, we see increased frequency and severity of extreme weather events worldwide, including in the UK. So those droughts, flooding events, tropical storms, heat waves. And net zero, by definition, is the only way to halt further warming. Since human greenhouse gas emissions are by far the dominant cause of this warming, if we add no additional carbon dioxide or methane or other greenhouse gases, then we will see no further warming. So net zero means that total greenhouse gas emissions are balanced by greenhouse gas removal, and those are either naturally or technologically. So naturally being trees, or technologically some other methods to remove carbon dioxide or greenhouse gases from the atmosphere. Reducing emissions is the go-to method because it's very, very hard to simply remove the carbon dioxide, remove the emissions that we emit every year, because there's so many of them. And the UK, via that 2008 Climate Change Act, has a legally binding target to reach net zero by 2050. So where are we at now? Well, 2024 was the hottest year in record, with global temperatures 1.6 degrees Celsius above the pre-industrial levels. Now, this does not mean we have exceeded the 1.5 degrees target permanently, because that requires sustained average temperatures above this threshold. But the 1.6 degrees Celsius anomaly was likely influenced by the short-term variability, such as there was El Nino that year. But at this time, human-induced warming stands at around 1.3 degrees Celsius, but will continue to rise at around 0.2 degrees Celsius per decade at current rates. So what about emissions? We've heard about temperatures. They're warmer than average. What about emissions? Are we still emitting at record rates? And yes, in 2023, global human-caused carbon dioxide emissions reached 41 gigatons, which is the highest ever recorded. Although we should note here, while total emissions continue to rise, the rate of increase has slowed over the past 25 years, which means that global emissions are likely to peak this decade, and with per capita emissions already declining. So what about across the world? There are countries like China and India where their emissions are still increasing year on year, and there are other countries such as the USA and the UK and many of the EU countries where their emissions have decreased year on year. And UK greenhouse gas emissions in 2023 were 423 megatons carbon dioxide, which is a 50% reduction from 1990 levels. Some people here would be quick to point out that the UK emits less than 1% of global emissions. So what's the point of trying to get to net zero if it's barely going to make a dent in the total emissions? But here we have to remember that over 1/4 of global emissions come from countries that each emit less than 1% of the total global emissions. If none of these countries did anything, then that's a whole lot of emissions that would continue to be produced. Additionally, the UK has produced a whole lot of emissions since the start of the Industrial Revolution. So while we do not produce too many emissions now, we did in the past. So cumulative UK carbon dioxide emissions since 1750 are approximately 79 gigatons of carbon dioxide, which represents 4.4% of the historic total. And the reduction in emissions that we've seen, so we're down 50% from 1990 levels in the UK, have largely been down to decarbonising the electricity grid. So firstly, basically phasing out coal power completely. In 2024, the final coal power station was shut down. Coal releases less energy per unit mass than other fossil fuels, such as gas, so you must burn more and produce more carbon dioxide by doing that. Also, we've quite significantly expanded the renewable energy capacity in the grid. So on a day like today, it's kind of windy, and I checked what the current mix is, so how much energy is produced by each energy source. On today, 49% is produced by renewables and approximately 23% via gas. So almost 50% of the energy that I'm using right now to record this episode from the grid is coming from renewables. Mostly wind, because we have a lot of wind here in the UK. Not a whole lot of sun today, but on some days a little bit of sun. So yeah, the large reductions we've seen mostly come through decarbonising the electricity grid. I hope in this section that I have somewhat demonstrated that it is a necessity that we reach net zero, because if we don't, we'll witness continual increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations, which will then lead to a continued increase in average surface temperature. So now let's take a look at the cost of net zero. So in politics and media, we often see that net zero is portrayed to be very, very expensive or economically harmful, destroys the economy, whatever. So Nigel Farage's Reform Party pledges to scrap net zero policies, to cut energy bills, argues that net zero damages the economy and wastes money, and claims that fossil fuels are cheaper and more reliable than renewables. And same with the Conservative Party, led by Kemi Badenoch, proposing to repeal the Climate Change Act of 2008, arguing that the UK cannot afford the target. She also said that net zero policy and the building of renewables is making everyone's bills more expensive. It's important here to note that not all Conservatives are critical of net zero, and some do support it, but the current stance of the Conservative Party is fairly against net zero. And we'll see in this section that these politicians are routinely downplaying the risks of climate change and inflate the costs of decarbonisation while ignoring the benefits. And these benefits can be quite large, and the claims are politically motivated. Many receive funding directly from fossil fuel interests, and they also use net zero as a scapegoat for the high energy prices, which attracts voters. So what are the actual costs? Much of the data in this section comes from the 7th Carbon Budget, which is produced by the Climate Change Committee. The Climate Change Committee is an independent body established that basically its purpose is to advise the UK government on emissions targets and how to reach net zero. So how much money is net zero going to cost the UK? According to the 7th Carbon Budget, required investment between 2025 and 2050 is on average £26 billion per year. Now this does sound like a lot. Now this £26 billion per year that we spend on average will be offset by an average of £22 billion per year from operational and efficiency savings that we get from moving to this new technology. This could be, for instance, when generating electricity via renewable technologies, there are no fuel costs. So you get huge operational savings because, it's unlike a gas power station where you have to buy and lose a gas to burn, that energy generation from, say, wind or solar does not cost any money. So the net average cost is £4.4 billion per year, which is around 0.2% of GDP. So the net cumulative cost between 2025 and 2050, which is when net zero should be reached, is around £110 billion, which investment-wise peaks at around £33 billion in 2029. After 2041, the transition becomes a net cost saving, achieving £35 billion in annual savings by 2050. Now, while £4.4 billion is still a lot of money, most of that investment will not come from the government, but will come from the private sector, given the right incentives are in place. There will be some public spending, however, needed for one-off infrastructure upgrades and to ensure that the costs are fairly distributed. So if we looked at this 10 years ago, the amount of money required to reach net zero would be estimated to be a lot higher. And this is because that over recent years, the technology that we will be using to reach net zero has fallen dramatically in cost. So low carbon technologies that do currently still have relatively high upfront costs, but their prices are rapidly declining due to innovation and economies of scale. For example, offshore wind and solar energy are now down to about 25% of 2010 levels. So that's huge. These renewable technologies have come down to be a quarter of the price of 15 years ago. Battery prices, which are used to store energy, store energy from renewables or to power electric cars, for instance, the price per kilowatt hour, so the energy capacity, is down 80% over the last decade. And EVs are very likely to reach price parity with internal combustion vehicles. That means that they'll cost around the same for a similar model, internal combustion engine vehicles and EVs, and they're expected to reach price parity by 2026 to 2028 and becoming cheaper thereafter. Now, this is very important. For these technologies to be implemented at large scales, they need to be cost effective and cost competitive with other alternatives. And this gets us to the point where these technologies are not just better for the environment and to prevent further warming, but they're also the cheapest option, which means they are the best choice financially. So even if there was no need to get to net zero, they would still be the better option. And what about operational savings? While renewables still have that initial investment required, say to build the offshore wind farms or onshore wind farms or solar farms, you have minimal maintenance and you also have zero fuel costs because the fuel comes from the sun, whether that be directly, say for solar, or indirectly through powering the wind. Whereas with gas, you have to buy the gas to generate the electricity, and so that's continued fueled costs there. Electric vehicles, they are more efficient than internal combustion engine vehicles. Whereas internal combustion engine vehicles can only convert around 15 to 30% of the energy in the fuel to kinetic energy, electric vehicles can convert over 70% of the energy into kinetic energy. Building insulation. While it does cost money to improve the insulation in buildings across the UK, insulation reduces the heating and cooling energy demand, and so you spend less money in the long term heating your house or trying to keep it cold. Additionally, heat pumps are far more efficient than gas boilers and so will also cost less with lower energy prices. Okay, so from this section we found that it will cost on average around £26 billion per year to reach net zero over the next 25 years. However, much of the money that is required to get to this point comes from the private sector and not from the government. Additionally, we find that on average over this same 25-year period, there will be savings per year around £22 billion on average, which means there's a net cost of around £4.4 billion per year, which equates to around 0.2% of UK GDP. We also found that the costs required to get to net zero have dropped massively over the past couple of decades, simply because innovation and economies of scale have driven the prices down massively, such that renewable technologies and battery technologies have gone down significantly in price. So when Nigel Farage says that scrapping net zero will save the UK £40 billion per year, he is wrong on this. So people who criticise net zero, not only do they tend to ignore the operational cost savings that you get from striving for net zero, but they also ignore the cost of continuing as we do now. Think of all that infrastructure we have currently that we use to generate our electricity, such as gas and nuclear power plants. These require maintenance and rebuilding with time. The UK currently has nuclear reactors with a mean age of over 37 years. They will need to be replaced at some point soon, and this will be expensive. Think of Hinkley Point C. It's costing nearly £50 billion for 2 reactors. Now this will power 6 million homes, and while building new nuclear is required, as nuclear is a low carbon technology, as required to reach net zero, we cannot ignore the costs of this. And these expenditures are often ignored in cost comparisons. Another big cost that is ignored is the cost of inaction. So in order to prevent further warming from happening, we have to get to net zero, right? Because if you continue adding more carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, increasing the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we are going to get more warming. As I said earlier, for every increase in carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere, you get a fairly linear increase in temperature. So if you continue adding carbon dioxide, we'll get hotter. And so by downplaying the need to get to net zero, you're essentially downplaying the costs that are associated with that further warming. So the IPCC projects that 10 to 23% decline in annual global GDP by 2100 under high global warming scenarios. The economic benefit of limiting warming below 2 degrees Celsius far exceeds the mitigation costs, even before accounting for co-benefits. Now, this is because climate change disrupts all aspects of life. We live in this thin layer of air around the Earth called the troposphere. If that warms, and the effects of this warming are widespread, which is what we are observing currently, then it will impact us a lot. So, food production. We all need to eat, right? That's kind of what we do. With a warming climate, we have lower crop yields, greater variability in the conditions around us, the weather, extreme weather events, and we are seeing food inflation. So an example, the UK had excessive rainfall between 2023 and 2024, which caused waterlogged soils, delayed planting, and resulted in a 5% drop in vegetable yields, and this caused prices to increase. What about other prices? Well, we've seen rising cocoa and chocolate prices linked to climate impacts. This is the same with other products such as coffee, olive oil. These are all affected by the increase in average global temperature, which has led to more extreme weather events, which has led to lower crop yields. Extreme weather damages. So the LA wildfires that we saw at the start of this year caused approximately $200 billion in damages. Increasing the frequency and severity of extreme events will make, for instance, home insurance unaffordable or unavailable, meaning that you cannot get insurance for your house, and so no one's going to buy it. This applies to the UK too. For instance, areas at high flood risk are not going to be able to get insurance either. Now, climate change already costs the UK approximately 1% of its GDP per year, which is projected to reach 3.3% by 2050 and over 7% by 2100. So this is a real issue which is affecting us today, and it's only going to get worse with further warming. Additionally, what about the health impacts of climate change? So in 2022 we had that heat wave where we saw record temperatures across the UK, and that heat wave resulted in around 3,000 excess deaths. So going forward with time, with that further warming and the further more frequent and more severe extreme weather events such as heat waves, it could be other events such as more powerful tropical storms, very heavy rainfall leading to flooding. These can cause negative health impacts also and result in excess deaths. And so with the further warming, these are only going to get worse, and we're going to see more and more excess deaths. Now, compared with these losses, spending 0.2% of GDP on average annually to reach net zero is highly cost effective. But I should note here that this does depend on whether other countries act as well, because carbon dioxide emissions are spread across the world, so lowering emissions in one place will not lower warming that much unless other places also reduce their emissions. So it's not only the UK that has a responsibility in lowering its carbon emissions. What about other countries though? So even countries like China that get a very bad reputation for being huge emission emitters are rolling out massive amounts of renewable technology. The country aims to have 80% of its total energy mix coming from non-fossil fuel sources by 2060, and at current time it is the country that deploys the most renewable energy. Other economies do also have ambitious goals of decarbonisation. Okay, so in this section we have covered the cost of inaction, which is essentially the cost if we just let our emissions continue on the path that they are now. So basically a higher emission scenario where we do not reach net zero. So in the future, if there continues to be large increases in average surface temperatures, we'll see that this will massively negatively impact global GDPs. We thus find that lowering temperature rise to below 2 degrees above pre-industrial levels through net zero policy will massively save money in the long term, and the economic benefit of limiting the warming below 2 degrees will exceed the cost of reaching net zero massively. So when politicians tell you that net zero is not worth it because it's too expensive, they are massively underestimating the cost that climate change will have on our future economy. So what about the co-benefits of achieving net zero? So possibly the biggest one is energy affordability and stability in prices. Gas is the most expensive source of energy in the UK grid at this time, and the price of gas can fluctuate quite significantly. We saw during 2022 energy crisis, which was caused by a war in Ukraine, demonstrated the vulnerability of the UK economy on fossil fuel dependence. So we saw that the price of gas spiked, and thus the price of our energy spiked also. This renewable energy has minimal ongoing costs once it's installed. So transitioning to renewables stabilises the prices and reduces inflation risk. In fact, approximately 50% of recessions in the past 50 years in the UK have been caused by energy price shocks. So when the price of energy increases rapidly. So if we want a strong economy in the long term, we are going to want to stabilise those energy prices. And it's also important to note that while on a given day we can have a high proportion of our energy generated by renewable technology, the price is ultimately set by the most expensive generation method on the grid. So how does this work? Say you have a certain amount of electricity demand and you have different methods of generation. So it could be wind, it could be solar, nuclear, gas, etc. And they will submit a bid, which is the minimum price per unit of energy that they are willing to supply electricity. Then the system operator will rank these bids from lowest to highest. Obviously, they want to buy the cheapest sources of energy first, so they are accepted first. So you fill up the demand with the cheapest sources first, which typically are renewables, and then nuclear, and then gas. So the process continues until the total generation matches the demand which is required. And the last unit of electricity required to meet the total demand is called the marginal unit, and that sets the wholesale market price for all electricity at that time. So even if 99% of electricity comes from the cheapest source, say renewables and nuclear, and only 1% is required to match the demand, 1% through gas is required to match the demand of electricity, then that 1%, the price of gas per megawatt hour or per unit of energy is the price that people pay for the wholesale price of electricity. But to sum up, renewables are typically cheaper than gas per megawatt hour, and the prices are usually also more stable than gas. And typically, energy price stability allows for economic stability, which I'm pretty sure we all want. Another co-benefit of net zero is economic growth, because investment in clean technologies drives innovation, job creation, and economic expansion. And it's found that the net zero economy is growing relatively quickly, and last year added £83 billion to national income. Another major one is public health. So air pollution causes approximately 8 million deaths per year. In the UK, that is still definitely a problem, with around 28,000 to 36,000 deaths per year. Between 2017 and 2025, air pollution was expected to cost the NHS and social care system approximately £1.6 billion. Decarbonisation improves air quality and reduces healthcare costs. So how do we get to net zero? We talked a little bit about how much it will cost to get there, the co-benefits, the savings we get through operational costs. How do we get there? Well, the Climate Change Committee report that this episode is based on, the 7th Carbon Budget, outlines how we get to net zero, and it's important to note here that these budgets are made something like 12 years in advance to give the governments time to basically implement any technologies. So this 7th Carbon Budget is basically the plan for the UK government to limit emissions between 2038 and 2042. So what is the plan? Well, the first part of the plan is to implement more low carbon technologies. So first things first, electricity generation. We've already seen a massive decarbonisation through the reduction of coal and increased renewables, but with further electrification, so electrification of industry, for instance, you're using more electricity overall, and that also includes, say, we need to increase the amount of EVs, so that's going to require more electricity, and so the demand from the electricity grid is going to be much higher in the future as we rely more on electricity rather than other sources of energy. So we'll see our increase in different renewable energy technologies, whether that be onshore, offshore wind, which is going to increase from 15 gigawatts capacity in 2023 up to 88 gigawatts in 2040, and the cost per megawatt hour is expected to fall from £49 down to £35. Onshore wind capacity is set to double to 32 gigawatts by 2040, and also increase solar from 16 gigawatts up to 82 gigawatts in 2040, with the price per megawatt hour falling from £52 to £29. Important to note here that because the energy generation here depends on the climate, well, it depends on the weather, different areas of the UK are going to experience different weather, and so it may be very, very windy in certain parts of the UK. You need to be able to transfer that electricity long distances from the point of generation to the point of demand. So we require large infrastructure upgrades in transmission so we can get that energy around the place. The next big one is transport. So everyone drives cars, basically. Cars, as we discussed earlier, they are not very efficient, and they also rely on fossil fuels. And so EV adoption is going to have to increase to reduce emissions from carbon dioxide. By 2040, we expect that 80% of cars and 74% of vans are electric. Buildings. To heat buildings, we're going to be moving away from gas boilers to electric heat pumps, whereas now we only have around 1% of homes having an electric heat pump. By 2040, expect just over 50% to have one, which is going to require a massive increase in installations from around 60,000 in 2023 up to around 1.5 million per year in 2035. Now, the UK is lagging a bit behind the curve with installations of heat pumps. Other countries have adopted this technology much earlier than us, but the aim is we will catch up. So industry, as we talked about a bit before, the aim is to electrify industry to meet around 61% of energy demand by 2040, which is up from 26% in 2022. So basically electrifying any processes that required fossil fuels before, so electric boilers, ovens, furnaces, industrial heat pumps. We'll also see increasing capacity of other energy sources, such as nuclear, which is set to increase from 6 to 11 gigawatts by 2050. We should also see implementation of battery storage across the grid, which is designed to store excess energy created or generated by renewable technology, and this can be put out back into the grid during periods of low renewable generation. Now, some sectors will be pretty difficult to decarbonise, in particular aviation and shipping. Aviation is very hard to decarbonise because you get such great energy density from petrol, basically. So it's unlikely that we'll see electrification of aviation anytime soon, but may see some transition to lower carbon fuels. And this applies to shipping as well. So part of net zero is obviously decreasing emissions, but the other part, where we're not going to fully be able to emit no carbon, it's probably unlikely, very unlikely that we'll get to a position where emitting zero carbon whatsoever. And so to reach net zero, we have to do something to remove carbon that's already in the atmosphere. And so carbon removals include land-based methods, such as increasing the amount of woodland. So in the UK, approximately 13% of land is covered by woodland, and so by 2040 we expect around 16% to be covered. And trees are very good at storing carbon because they are made of carbon. By photosynthesis they take carbon, convert it into glucose, and by growing store that carbon in their tissues. Additionally, restoring peatlands, which also store quite a lot of carbon. 2040, expect around 55% of peatlands to be restored. There may be some engineered carbon removals as well, so bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. The aim here is you basically grow a load of biomatter, so trees for instance, chop them down, burn them, and so initially during that growing process it removes carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, burn them, which will produce carbon dioxide, but then you store that carbon dioxide and that prevents release back into the atmosphere. So you've net removed carbon. One last way to reduce carbon emissions is to reduce our high carbon activities. So this could be, instead of using the car so much, taking more public transport or cycling or walking around the place. It could be reducing your consumption of meat, because meat and farming, meat typically is quite a carbon intense and water intense operation. Other things such as reducing the amount of aviation demand, and then lastly increasing recycling rates. So in this section we very, very briefly covered how the UK is planning on getting to net zero by 2050. And so the main ones are implementation of low carbon technologies, mainly in energy, electricity generation, so we're generating more electricity using renewables, and also increasing the amount of generation so we can electrify. The next one, where we cannot completely stop emitting carbon into the atmosphere, we aim to remove it. And so those can be land-based removals, such as increasing the number of trees and restoring peatlands, or they can be engineered removals, such as bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And then lastly, we're also planning on reducing the demand for high carbon activities. Okay, so that brings us roughly to the end of this episode. I feel like we've covered quite a lot in this episode, so I'm going to quickly summarise kind of what we've talked about today. So there's been a growing anti-net zero sentiment, particularly from right-wing politicians. So we talked about Donald Trump in the US, Kemi Badenoch and Nigel Farage in the UK. These politicians are misleading the public on net zero. They claim that net zero is harmful to the economy But in reality, what they are claiming is simply serving fossil fuel interests and not the general population. Reform UK has been paid millions of pounds by the fossil fuel industry. And if someone can pay Nigel Farage £70 to say this,
"What did you do with Big Chungus?"
then what's he willing to say for much more money? Additionally, while the UK's share of global emissions is small, it does not make the efforts to net zero futile, because over a quarter of global emissions come from countries emitting less than 1% of the global total. Additionally, the UK bears some historic responsibility as one of the first industrialised nations. We have been emitting carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere since the beginning of the industrial time. Also, here we have to remember that even if carbon dioxide reduction was ignored, net zero still remains economically and socially worthwhile, because by striving for net zero, we will find that energy prices will stabilise, get public health improvements, and longer-term prosperity. Many critics of net zero will exaggerate the costs while overlooking the importance of getting there and also the massive co-benefits. So that is everything from this episode of the Curiosity Monkey podcast. I do hope you enjoyed this episode. If you have any episode suggestions or feedback, please do not hesitate to contact us. See you in the next episode.